What's up, y'all? New episode of Believe in Kentucky on the Believe Network. Alongside Cole Park. My name is Vinny Hardy. We're here to talk all things Cats. Cole, man, outside of the press box at Williams-Brice and Sanford Stadium, how was all the traveling to Columbia and Athens and all points in between? Because we know how the games went, but how was everything else?
Not too bad. Had a little bit of travel issues getting to Athens for that noon game. A little bit of a mixed bag there of late start to the morning and unfortunate start to the morning with some bad seafood, we'll say. But we got there in the end, got to witness that game in all of its glory. Got to see some Georgia fans not even really be all that happy about it, just kind of feel like, this was still disappointing somehow. But all in all, they got a beautiful new press box up there since the last time I was down there. It used to be kind of more of an outside press box kind of deal. Now they've got a beautiful new press box up there up top. It was very nice, very, good accommodations there for the media. South Carolina always has a good press box, always good food down there in South Carolina as well. And the travel, I'm sure the average person would look at my day for both of those weekends and be like, that's crazy. I couldn't do it, but I've been doing this for 5 years. I have done far worse when I was a student journalist, sleeping out of my truck and driving 15 and a half hours straight. So it wasn't too bad. It's all stuff that I'm used to and capable of doing. I feel like driving is one of those things that, the average person may be like a 4-hour drive, not for me, but 4-hour drive to me, that's a day trip there and back. Like, I don't care. Like, that's fine. I feel like it's one of those things, the more you do it, the more comfortable you get with it, the more you kind of grasp what you are and aren't capable of on the road.
Mm-hmm.
Have to be careful, but so nothing out of the ordinary for me on either of those weekends, but a nice new press box in Georgia.
So it was light work. This little weekend was light work. I got you.
Light work.
Unfortunately, Kentucky was light work for South Carolina and Georgia, and we highlighted it. You talked about it after the South Carolina game. All the boxes that they didn't check about things they were hoping to do, didn't accomplish it. Go to Athens. They're coming off a loss, so we all had a pretty good idea how that was going to go. And we know how limited they are offensively. Now we're here bye week number 2, and we know how the bye weeks go. And then Texas comes to town, which Stoops talked today. There is the Texas game somehow maybe a tad easier than we thought it might be going into the year. I mean, is that even a thought worth uttering into the ethos?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the schedule, who's left, I guess, in terms of best opportunities to get an SEC win, yeah, I'm sure Texas is probably up there. But also, I would put a win at Texas as not that far off from just not winning an SEC game this year, which is still also a real possibility. If there were Vegas betting lines on it, I bet it'd be pretty close. So regardless, Stoops was asked about that. Someone asked him, Texas, they're really not what we thought they were going to be this year. They're a bit of a weaker Texas squad. And Stoops' answer kind of made me chuckle a little bit. He said it's interesting, right? Because, I mean, they're still pretty good, right? Like, he's like, yeah, like, I get it. He's like, you're right. Preseason number 1 and all that. Like, clearly they haven't lived up to what they wanted to live up to, but they're still a very good football team, and they played a very hard schedule. They were playing Ohio State. The Florida game was a tough one. We saw what Florida even Florida, for their USF losses, they played close with LSU. They've played some good games this year, I suppose. But it was in the Swamp. The Swamp's always a tough place to play. Anyone can say that. Even it's kind of one of those deals. It's like a South Carolina. Even when South Carolina or Florida are bad, their home atmosphere just makes it that much tougher. The Swamp is a great place to play. Williams-Brice is a great place to play. So his point was, yeah, I mean, we recognize that Texas isn't what we thought they were going to be, but they're still a very good football team. And, it's not, it's the SEC. The easiest game in the SEC is still an SEC game, and you can't take any of those for granted. It'll be interesting to see. Coming out of the Georgia game, maybe it's just a testament of where the program's at right now. Maybe it's a testament of like kind of everything that's going on. But I felt more optimistic out of the Georgia game than anything, which is weird to say because I know most people are going to be like, well, it was a blowout loss. The game was decided with over 20 minutes left to go. It never really felt like, apart from maybe like a few minutes there, Kentucky ever really had a chance. And yeah, defensively, I'm very concerned. There's a lot of concerns defensively, but offensively, I was a little bit excited by what I saw. I actually had some optimism coming out of this game because, quite frankly, going into Athens, I didn't think Kentucky had a chance. I really didn't. And I didn't think it was going to be close either. And it was arguably closer than I thought it would be. So I was coming in there with no expectations and ready to just kind of cover a tough game. And I was surprised by what I saw because I saw a Kentucky team that, while still imperfect, while still flawed, actually seemed to listen to some of the offensive issues they've been having. Like, how many times, I guess we as jaded sports fans understand, but, when I was talking to Bush Hamdan and Cutter Boley and the running backs and all these guys in practice leading up to the Georgia game, and they're saying, well, we need to work on this. We know we need to do this better. Yeah, we might do this. I listened to all that and I was like, that sounds great. They're not going to do any of it. Like, you can tell me that you're not doing something right, but that doesn't mean necessarily you're going to make those changes. That's how sports works, and maybe that's the Calipari effect still lingering. I covered Calipari for several years, and Calipari can tell you up and down what they did wrong and then not do anything about it. So, going through the whole week, I was listening to all these suggestions and things like, yeah, we might be looking at doing that, and just being like, yeah, whatever. All right, I'll believe when I see it. But going against Georgia, they actually did do a lot of those things. We saw the running backs catch the football. Seth McGowan, Dante Dowdell still struggled to get involved in that a little bit, had just one pass for a short game, but Seth McGowan had a couple big plays with catches, and this was a game where the run game, Seth McGowan a little bit banged up, still kind of struggled to really solidify himself on the ground against a really tough Georgia run defense, but he made some big plays through the air. We saw wide receivers get open a lot more. Not the best game from Fred Ferrier, but he had a couple good looks there that, had he caught that ball, would have been big gains, would have been big plays. We saw Cameron Miller out there in garbage time, a freshman wide receiver, guys we've been wanting to see. Still no Quisenberry, but we saw Cam Miller out there make some big plays, make some big gains. And I know it was garbage time, kind of empty stats, but it was noteworthy. And, Bush Hamdan, Mark Stoops, those guys said we have to give him more looks now. He's playing his way into more playing time. And even today, Stoops said, this bye week, we're looking at some more of those young guys. We're trying to give them opportunities. The DJ Millers, maybe even Montavious Quisenberry. We'll see. I saw, Cutter Boy threw an interception, sure, but it didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. You look at the box score and you see one interception, that's concerning. But if you actually go look at that play, it was a fourth down. It was a busted play anyway. There was nothing there, and he tries to throw it out the back of the end zone, and Georgia gets an insane acrobatic toe tap out of the side of the end zone for the interception. So, okay, do I care? By going for it on fourth down, you already conceded you weren't taking the field goal. So worst case scenario, you throw an interception in the end zone, it just is a touchback. Best case scenario, it was a turnover on downs from the spot anyway. Like, okay, I'm not concerned about that. That's fine. That was a concession you made going for it on fourth down. Cutter Boley looked confident. He made better throws. He seemed to better understand what he needs to do to protect himself, what he needs to do to make better plays. After the game, he said he felt comfortable. He liked the way the game was called by Bush Hamdan. The protection was a lot better. He only got sacked twice, and one of those was pretty late in the game there. Only 2 sacks and 1 in real meaningful game minutes compared to 6 against South Carolina. So if anything, as crazy as it sounds after this just thumping at Georgia where the defense looked not great, I left the game feeling more optimistic because I listened to a whole week of Kentucky saying what they need to change offensively, and then went out there against Georgia. And even if it wasn't enough, I saw them actually make some of those changes. And that tells me that Kentucky I'm not going to say they could live up to the expectations that Bush Hamdan and some of those guys maybe set out for them or maybe believe they could, but I believe that Kentucky could be more than a bad offensive team if they can keep doing what they're doing.
So if you're more than a bad offensive team, then you move into what category? So what if they're not? Then if they're not that, then what are they?
I don't want to say. I would like to say they could be a good offensive team. Okay. I don't know. I'm talking like grand scope of college football. I don't know that Kentucky will ever get to a point this season where like that's a good offense,
right?
You know, in the grand scheme of nationally, because you've got teams like Ole Miss who are just insane with those explosives. But I think Kentucky could be at least a reliable offensive team, a team that could. You have to actually be concerned they're going to get into the end zone and not shoot themselves in the foot before doing it. If they can keep making these changes and continue to play better and more cohesively as a unit, keep making these, plays to get guys open, get them better looks, keep giving Cutter Boley opportunities to make plays when he's not on his back on the ground, and, keep getting these guys involved, keeping things unpredictable. The running backs can be a running threat and a catching threat. The receivers can get open. You can do those jet sweeps if you want to do those jet sweeps. You can do all these plays. And, I think if they can continue at this route, we could be moving into it feels crazy to say if you had said this at the start of the season after the Toledo game or even the Ole Miss game, but it feels like if things continue to trend this way, by the end of the season, Kentucky could be a team that we say, well, the offense was better than the defense was this year.
That the defense is leaving that door open.
They are
for the offense to walk in. That's the second part of the caveat, and it's can they walk in that door? Because the defense even leaving that a possibility is surprising. You said concerning, and I don't think we foresaw that. You knew the back end would have to carry them to the the front got some continuity and some chemistry, but yeah, it's just not what we've been accustomed to seeing.
Yeah, I mean, they're really weak around the edges, and I think part of that, I'm not calling any guy out in particular, but you look at what this defense lost, and it's college football, that's sports, but it feels like this is something that we got talked about a little bit in the offseason, but it feels like the first season where Kentucky didn't have, a J.J. Weaver or a guy like that at an outside linebacker who you just knew could go and make a play. It feels like Alex Safari's playing inside. Maybe he could be better used outside, but then who would play his spot? Who's going to fill that role? I don't really know. It seems like, they're really bad at tackling around the edges. And Stoops even said today, part of that's just our positioning. Part of that's, players not being where they need to be, losing one-on-one battles. They just, for a lot of reasons, they just are struggling defensively. And the problem with that is you can work to try to cover up some of these flaws. You can work to try to, bolster that. But film exists. And if one team figures out how to crack your defense, every team that you play after that is watching that. They're going to see where you're weak. They're going to see that you're weaker on the edges. They're going to see that for whatever reason, your guys are getting bad angles, bad looks around the edges. They're getting bad looks outside, and they're going to go outside. Mm-hmm. They're saying, hey, this guy, he's struggling to make some tackles. He's reliable. He is something Brad White's talked about. He's reliable. He's been good, but one of every 10 plays, he's just off. Maybe he's good. Maybe he's on it 9 out of 10 times, but one of those times he's off. And if you see him drift, you go right there and you're going to get a big game. These are things. This is the SEC. These are teams that are playing at the highest level of the sport. They have scouts. They have film reviewers who are looking at this stuff. And if you have a weak point like this defense has, maybe several, it's going to continue to be exploited until it's kind of just an avalanche.
It's funny that you mentioned J.J. Weaver, and it's that classic, you don't know what you got until it's gone, because the bulk of the time that J.J. was here, I feel that we all were just kind of waiting for him to still blow up. Like, he's solid, but we just know that, he's good. fair or not, he's coming in the shadow of Josh Allen and all that. And, we just kept thinking, yeah, okay. But next year he would be poor JJ Weaver. And now you wish you had him back. Because
Yeah.
look what's followed him, and we're like, the weaknesses and the Achilles heel. So yeah, you don't know what you got till it's gone.
Yeah, I mean, it's also just a matter of expectations too. I mean, I feel like when he was here, Maxwell Harrison's a guy I was critical of a lot, and that sounds crazy to some people who may not be as locked in, but I was pretty critical of Max a lot. I had a friend tell me once, like, yeah, it's easy to get a couple interceptions in a game if you're targeted like 30 times, and I would kind of just laugh and listen to that, but I thought he had some flaws, but now that he's gone, you're like, I wish I had that guy. And it's the same,
Yeah.
there was such high expectations on Deion Walker coming in here after his first season that he was going to be this monster that even when he was a really good defensive lineman at Kentucky, it felt disappointing because you were just waiting for that next level.
Mm-hmm.
And, the Kentucky's pretty lucky that they've got a really good front line now that maybe not as many people are saying, I miss Deion Walker as much as I miss JJ Weaver.
Yeah.
There could have easily been a scenario this year where that was the case, where as disappointing as a lot of people felt Deion was because he didn't live up to the potential that he seemed like he had, you're still missing a great football player at that position. Whether or not he lived up to the potential of how great he could have been, he was still a very good, very reliable football player. And losing those guys, it's tough. That's the nature of college sports. It's part of why we love it. The turnover is part of why we love it. But it's really, really hard to fill some of those shoes sometimes. And I feel like there are several areas in this defense where those shoes are not quite filled. There's a little bit too much room in the toes. There's a little bit, not enough security around the ankles. Wouldn't want to play basketball in these shoes. You're going to roll an ankle,
Exactly. We'll switch to basketball here in just a little bit. But before we do, uh, as mentioned, we're always coming to y'all on the Believe Podcast Network. Feel free to rate, review, subscribe, give us 5 stars, and listen wherever you get your podcasts and watch us on YouTube and all that good stuff. We know all the dubious numbers and stats about Kentucky football. We know where we are. We know we've went a full calendar year without an SEC win. We know what bed we're lying in right now, Cole, from a perception standpoint or how good are we standpoint. So with that being said, who's the 15th best team in the SEC in your opinion?
Arkansas.
Wow, no hesitation.
No.
Wow.
Well, in my defense, 247 Sports, we vote in a weekly SEC media poll, all 16 beat reporters from SEC schools for 247 Sports. We vote every single week, and Arkansas has been my 15 for weeks and weeks and weeks. Now, Kentucky hasn't been my 16 for weeks and weeks and weeks. They were actually 19th last week behind Georgia Tech, Sewanee, and Tulane for old time's sake. But no, in all actuality, Kentucky is 16th and Arkansas is my 15. I can give you my full list if you'd like to hear it.
I mean, yeah, because Bobby Petrino coming to Knoxville. If they don't do anything else, they're gonna put some points on the board. I mean, he might not even have a defensive staff if he's because he cleaned everybody out. I don't know if he replaced those guys or not, but it could be a shootout in Knoxville Saturday.
Could be. Now, I do my polls based on what I've seen. There are a couple teams that are maybe ranked lower than teams that, like, in my head, I'm like, if they faced off, I think the lower team would probably win. But all I can go off of is what I've seen. What have you done? You know what I mean? Like, I'm trying to base this not on just bias and base this on what has happened, what the games have been. So I have Kentucky at 16, Arkansas at 15, South Carolina at 14, Florida, Mississippi State, dropped Texas all the way down to 11, Missouri, Auburn, Vanderbilt, Tennessee, LSU, Oklahoma, Georgia, Texas A&M, Alabama, and Ole Miss.
Missouri lower than I thought, but that's interesting.
Missouri, weirdly enough, has a number 1 vote from somebody. They won't tell me who, but from somebody in this poll. But when the actual poll came out, I can grab it for you real quick through my email if I can do this real quick. I didn't have this prepared. But I can tell you what the consensus was, because my ranking are just my ranking, but I can tell you what the actual final was when the poll dropped for us, which would have been come out on Monday, I believe. Sounds right? Yes. The final poll was Kentucky, Arkansas, South Carolina, Auburn, Mississippi State, Texas, Florida, Vanderbilt, Missouri up at 8th, a bit higher than I had them. Tennessee, LSU, Georgia, Oklahoma, Texas A&M had 2 first-place votes. Alabama at number 2 had 1 first-place vote. And at number 1, Ole Miss had 12 first-place votes. The only other team with a first-place vote outside of the top 3 was Missouri at number 8 with 1. I had Missouri down at 10, so not too far off the consensus. But, you know, that's how it kind of shook out there.
So Missouri, Alabama will be interesting. And look, you mentioned this is the best conference in the country. You talked about everybody at a high level. Your weaknesses get exposed. No stone goes unturned as far as scouting and film and opponents checking you out. And then when they find a weakness, you already said it, imitation is the greatest form of flattery. Everybody will attack that weakness until you can adjust, or you just die that kind of death if you're not able to combat the exposure being attacked. But Arkansas, they're 2-3, 0-1 in the conference, driving to take the lead on Ole Miss, driving to take the lead on Memphis, and they fumble and lose both of those games, which broke the
Charleston watching that.
Yeah, that's what that broke them. Of course, they're going to get blown out by Notre Dame after 2 losses like that. Their guts have just been ripped out. But if they beat Ole Miss, they're 1-0 in the SEC. The poll is completely flipped, and I mean it's that thin of a it's that thin of a line, man. It's crazy.
It is, and that's. I think stuff like that is not taken into account. I mean, people are making fun of the AP poll like crazy, and rightfully so. There were some crazy things in there, but people are making fun of the AP poll when Notre Dame was ranked when they were 0-2, but there were 2 one-score losses against teams that were ranked pretty highly. So, when you're looking at, where are they, it's hard to say they're not a top 25 team if they took 2 really highly ranked squads to the limit, and just lost narrowly. But like you said, Arkansas, I mean, it's the same story for Kentucky, though, right? Kentucky had a chance to beat Ole Miss.
Yeah.
It did. Ole Miss ends up squeaking it out against Kentucky, squeaking it out against Arkansas, which we heard all week about trap game there. But, that's 2 close wins against 2 bad teams in the SEC. But then Ole Miss does what Ole Miss does against LSU, and we're talking about a completely different Ole Miss team.
Yeah.
Now we're saying they're the best team in the SEC, and that's so far they've backed it up. Haven't played an Alabama yet. Haven't played a Georgia yet. Haven't even played a Texas yet. But it's like you said, it's a tough conference. Even last year when Mississippi State got completely blanked in the conference, there was a few of those games. They were right there in it. They were right there. Just didn't quite get it. And Kentucky was 1 point away from beating Georgia last year and one win in the conference. It's the nature of the beast in college football, and especially in the SEC, that the margins are so thin. And that's why I think it was so frustrating so much this season. It wasn't relief that Kentucky was losing games because it was shooting itself in the foot. It was frustrating because that's college football. At the end of the day, I get it. You could have beaten Ole Miss, but you didn't. And now that's a loss. Mm-hmm. And those losses are piling up. And yes, you were right there in so many of these games, not quite the Georgia game, but you were right there in so many of these games with opportunities. But if you can't capitalize on those opportunities, it's not a college basketball season. It's a college football season. There's not that many games. They will pass you by, and they'll pass you by quickly. And we've seen that happen time and time again. Because quite frankly, I get it was a building year for them last year, but Mississippi State fans didn't feel great about their 0-8 conference record because they almost won a few.
Yeah.
All they saw is that they didn't, and that's kind of where Kentucky's at right now too.
And we've heard Stoops say it a lot, and we saw it play out. A young quarterback, you got to play better around him. Austin Simmons comes in, and you mentioned corners getting picks. Ty Bryant gets 2 picks, and yet Ole Miss is able to play better around him and overcome those 2 giveaways and leave Lexington with that 1-score win that you mentioned.
Now they're playing better
So
on Trinidad Chambliss.
yeah, exactly. And I mean, Austin is out of a job, but our guy making his first start on the road in the SEC in Columbia, you get a
He
fumble
got sacked
for a
6 times.
touchdown, you get a pick, and we talk about playing better around him. We didn't have better play around him. Ole Miss did, and there's as polar opposite as Kentucky and Ole Miss are, it's still a thin margin.
Yeah, I mean, I would say they definitely played better around him at Georgia. The defense just didn't have enough to back it up, and by the time
On
yeah, I
second
mean,
down.
right. By the time by the time Kentucky had really started to make some of those moves, it kind of felt like the game was out of reach anyway. And there were still several of those offensive drives that probably should have resulted in something that flamed out. We can all talk about the drive to end the first half there. What happened to our kicker? I don't know. But that drive was frustrating. That one should have ended in a touchdown. It shouldn't have even been the first miss of the season for Jacob Cowaway, but it was. And also, I don't care. I'm not on the team. I'm not going to get fined. That was a catch. It wasn't out of bounds. It wasn't a drop. Willie Rodriguez, that was a catch. Fix it. But regardless, that's kind of where they're at. They still had flaws. They still made some mistakes. They still weren't perfect, but they did play better around him, and they put him in better positions to succeed. It was just that the game got so out of hand so fast against a Georgia. That's the kind of team that's going to jump on you from the start. It's the kind of team that's going to not be forgiving of any mistakes.
No.
And a down Georgia is still a Georgia. So, and that's kind of where my concern is coming into this week, because I know that it's not quite Georgia, but like a bad, frustrating Texas right now is still a good football team. They might not be the number one team in the country like we thought they were going to be, but they're still a very capable football team who could even still make the college football playoffs. At worst, is still probably going to win at least 8 or 9 games, and that's with an Arch Manning quarterback who has retroactively made everyone forgive Sark for not playing him over Quinn Ewers. Everyone now, like, people were so mad last year that Quinn Ewers was getting the start of everyone. Now everyone's like, I get it. I understand. I take it back. Sometimes the fans do not know as much as the coach does. I understand. So, that's where Texas is at. Their offense doesn't have that firepower. They don't trust their quarterback. But yet it's still Texas. And they still have a very good defense. And they still have very good players. And a down Georgia is still a Georgia. A down Texas is usually still a Texas. And that's just the whole schedule for Kentucky. I mean, you look down the line, you're looking at, a Auburn, which hasn't reached the highs it reached before, but they've still played some good games this year. Auburn's still shown guys who can make some plays. Mm-hmm. Florida is bad this year, but they just beat Texas. They played close with LSU. So, what do we have there? Vanderbilt. Maybe they did end up losing to Alabama, but they looked like they were right there with Alabama for a long time, and they played some big games. Tennessee, I mean, there's not really any easy teams left on this SEC schedule.
And there's that thin margin again. Vanderbilt's up 7, going in to at least be up 10-0, possibly 14-0 before Pavia fumbles. I mean, that whole complexion of the game is different. Bama fans were shook in the stands. They can say whatever they want. They were distraught. Like, that first quarter, they're like, oh my God, we're about to lose them again, because they go for it and throw the pick, and it's 7-0. Like I said, Vanderbilt's got the ball. They could have easily been down 2 scores before they knew it, and then pressure, nerves, the Bryant Denny gets tight and tense, and this is a whole different thing. It didn't work out that way. 14-14, they pulled away, but it's just can go so many different ways, just so many different twists and turns, and worked out for Bama. Now we'll see them against Missouri, and somebody will be for real, somebody won't. The dust just continues to settle every week. So
It's a constantly evolving landscape.
Absolutely. So flip to basketball because the football team did not really hold our attention to Big Blue Madness, which that was the fear. But in the summer, when you were dying to have work to do and dying to have the grind, and now here we're in the middle of it. Bye week, Big Blue Madness is Saturday. We had a cool fan fest thing that's going to be happening before, where you can meet the men, women's teams, get autographs and all that before the festivities kick off at 6, which that's a cool new addition. Um, Pro Day was yesterday. Your thoughts on that? You're a basketball guy, but your thoughts on going and covering the drills and the workout and a little bit of 5-on-5 scrimmage type stuff at the end.
Yeah, so it all kind of kicked off on Monday with Media Day. Now, for those unfamiliar with how Media Day works for us, we got into the historic Memorial Coliseum. Got into Historic Memorial Coliseum, HMC, talked to Mark Pope for about 40 minutes. Kenny Brooks came up to the podium, talked to him for a little while, and then we got led into a big open gym where the entire men's basketball team was each at different tables, and they basically put like 30 minutes on the scoreboard and said, go wild. Walk around, talk to whoever you want to for as long as you want to, go over and talk to as many players as you want to. So we got to talk with a bunch of players there. And then when that buzzer goes off, they start ushering you out there pretty quickly. So it was pretty cool to get to talk to the whole team. I've done several of these now, but got to learn a lot about some of these guys, some of these journeys they're on. And then obviously yesterday was Pro Day. We go back to HMC and kind of get to watch what it really just felt like an open practice in a lot of ways. It just so happened there were scouts from every single NBA team also there. And we got to see a little bit of what we heard about on Monday. We got to see a little bit of stuff we didn't hear about and see a whole bunch of things from this team. Still far too early to make any like hard decisions on what this team's going to be. But we got to see some of what they've been talking about in action, see some of these guys playing together for the first time. And a few things really stuck out to me. I've written a couple stories for the Cats Pause so far. One thing that stuck out to me really, really heavily was Mark Pope's insistence that offense isn't going anywhere. We know what this Kentucky team's identity is, but this year the goal is to be a top 10 team in defense. Mm-hmm. He said it'd be great if we could be number 1, but if we can at least slide into the top 10. Defense is going to be emphasized really heavily. And I talked to Colin Chandler about that a little bit. He's a guy who's been kind of praised and lauded for how he's leading the team defensively. He's a guy who, despite being a sophomore, he's an older guy where he went on his mission at BYU. He understands Mark Pope and his system, committing to him at BYU. He's kind of been a leader on this team. A team that's full of transfers and some young guys that, you got to take all those guys who are in a second year at the system as much as you can. And, that's something Chandler spoke about to me. He said the offense isn't going anywhere. We're still taking a lot of shots. We're putting up a lot of shots, he said. But sometimes it's not going to be our night. Those shots aren't going to fall, and sometimes it's out of our control. Sometimes you hit shots, sometimes you don't. He said our defense is something we can control all the time. He said whether or not the shots are falling, we can make sure we're making a defensive effort. We can make sure we're keeping them from scoring points. And then sometimes even in games where our shot doesn't fall, we can still get some wins there. And, we saw last year what can happen when this team does hit shots with the Florida game, beating the eventual national champions and representing a 106, like 10 something else game, thrilling game. But we also saw what happens when the shots don't fall and you lose by 20 to Ohio State in Madison Square Garden. And that was a bad loss, probably the worst loss of the season. So, there's a real push and a real emphasis on being a more defensive unit, being top 10 and all of that, controlling what you can control. And that's for good reason. When you look at the numbers, you break it down. No team outside of the top 20 has ever won. No team outside of the top 20 defensively has ever won the national championship in, I think, since 2000 or something like that. And there is a caveat there. I think Baylor technically was like 22 in 2020, but obviously that was the COVID season. They missed a couple games with COVID-19 where they had to sit out a couple games. It was a weird time in college sports. But for the most part, I think since this century, no team outside of the top 20 and only one team ever in a weird season has ever won the national championship. I feel like I just said that all wrong. You get what I'm saying. You need to be top 20 in defensive efficiency if you want to win the big one. And Kentucky has understood that. Last year, Kentucky was like 51 in defensive efficiency, I believe, which good team wasn't going to get it done and would have completely broken the trend that's been set this century. Had they done it, they didn't. So maybe there's a little bit of truth to that in what you need to be. And it seems defense is going to be a priority for these Cats this year. And I'm going to stop talking before I stumble over my words any further.
So yeah, they a conscious effort to tighten it up, and for lack of a better word, be like Mark Stoops and be balanced, to have the firepower offensively, but yet have some physicality, be able to clamp some people down when it gets a little more rugged. You got the versatility and athleticism to like you said, if the shots aren't falling and you're not scoring 85, 90 points a game, you can win a 71-68 game, 68-65. You scored 65 in that Ohio State game, you gave up 85 because you couldn't stop them. They kept penetrating and pick and rolling you to death, and it was just, a slow, agonizing death, and they were powerless to stop them that day in Madison Square Garden. So hopefully you can kind of combat that now. The depth is there, and he's a guy that uses his depth. I'm a fan of that. I'm not, everybody's different, but if you got depth and they can hoop, play your depth. All the different types of combinations they were using in practice, just to see how everybody interacts together, how they all play together. He mentioned how the white team had so many different combinations, guys, mixing it all up. I like the sounds of that as well. There's still that concern about, well, what happens if Jalen Lowe's in foul trouble? What if he gets hurt? Maybe they're not true point guards like Lowe, but you got, guys that are capable, Aberdeen and Chandler and Jasper and Oway. So many guys you can slide over there that can get the job done if need be, if Lowe's in foul trouble or, God forbid, gets dinged up or something like that. So,
yeah, just jumping in on that point, I think people got frustrated last year, myself included at times, when we'd see Colin Chandler running the point guard minutes, but that's a staple of what Mark Pope does with his teams. I mean, it's not an accident that last year when Kerr Kreese and Lamont Butler went out, Jackson Robinson was able to shift into the point guard position. And of course, Jackson Robinson gets hurt and it all goes out the window, but it's not a bug. It's a feature of Mark Pope's system that Colin Chandler is not a true point guard, but is capable of doing it. So that way, if injuries arise, if foul troubles arise, who knows? You have a guy that can slide into that role the same way Jackson Robinson did last year. He was one of Pope's guys. Maybe he didn't start his career with Pope, but he was one of Pope's guys, right? Yeah. And Colin Chandler is one of Pope's guys. So he's a guy who's going to play his role, be good at what he does, but also capable of sliding into that point guard role if something comes up. So if Jalen Lowe were to get in foul trouble, I would expect Colin Chandler to kind of take some of the point guard reps. I would also see Jasper Johnson. Obviously we'll see how there's always some questions when you talk about freshmen coming in, but I think he's looked really, really sturdy. I think he has a lot of high potential. He seems confident. I could see him taking some of those minutes. Obviously, you lose a little bit losing Travis Perry because he did a few of those point guard reps, I feel like, last year there at some points. But, oh, well, what can you do? Got recruited over. Understand his decision. But there's a couple guys who can kind of slot in that role. And I also think that this team is deep enough and veteran enough that there may be times where you don't necessarily need, not necessarily veteran enough, that's a bad way to put it, but a lot of these guys have played college basketball. They're not, even some of the transfers, they're not necessarily veterans, but they've played college basketball. So that's what I mean by that. You might not always necessarily need a true point guard. And I think something that was really interesting that stuck out to me, Pope was pretty candid about this fact. I wrote a column about this. You'll see it in our basketball yearbook when it comes out. But I said, if Kentucky manages to win the national title this year, there's going to be people out there who say, like, oh, look at how much money they spent. Look at how much talent's on their roster. They should have won it. I would say if Kentucky wins it this year, that is a phenomenal coaching job by Mark Pope, because the hardest part of this team is having too much. you know? And Pope was pretty candid about that at media day. He said, one of our biggest challenges all year long is going to be keeping everybody on the same page, you know, making sure we're all looking at the same vision, that we're all moving towards the same thing. We've got so much talent on this team. One of the biggest things is going to be keeping everybody going at the same rate. Jalen Lowe, I asked him about it. You know, he's the point guard. He's going to have to be a leader. He said, honestly, right now, it doesn't seem like an issue. We're all competitive. He's like, I know it might become one. I get it. But right now, these guys, we're just focused on helping the team. We want to win basketball games. We want to move forward. And he said, we're holding each other accountable. We got coaches holding us accountable. He's like, it's very team first oriented. And I think a lot of that goes back to what Mark Pope said as well on media day. Something else that really resonated with me and stuck out to me when I heard it, you know, had that little light bulb go off in my head in terms of stories. But he was asked about recruiting. And, you know, there's a lot of buzz out there right now with Kentucky being crystal balled to land Tyron Stokes. You know, obviously not getting Tay Kinney, who committed to Kansas. We'll see on all of that. But he was asked about recruiting and what that's like and, you know, doing that. And Mark Pope was very deliberate in saying, he said, recruiting here is not about bringing in the highest ranked player. He said, we know what Kentucky is, and we're looking for a certain type of player. He actually said this quote word for word, which really stuck out to me. He said, you would be shocked by how many times we mutually walk away. Mm-hmm. And that is something that, you know, you can say, sure, I guess. I heard that, you know, and there was a lot of those guys when I was still at the Colonel in the transfer portal where you're hearing like, oh, this guy ends up going here. You know, and that's the nature of the portal. It's very fast moving. But there were a couple guys who, you know, Kentucky reached out to him. So I threw him on my transfer portal tracker. But then he ends up committing to some other school somewhere else. And people are like, oh, Kentucky missed. But not really. Kentucky stopped talking to this guy a week ago. Mm-hmm. They didn't want him anymore. It was just they had reached out to him before. So he's still on the tracker, I guess. But yeah, we already knew he wasn't going to Kentucky. You know, like that. They did that. That ship had sailed. So I've heard that. I've heard Kentucky walking away from several players like this and walking away from several other, you know, guys that are recruits. You know, you hear, oh, it was a whiff on Kentucky's part, but Kentucky wasn't seriously pursuing that guy much anyway. Mm-hmm. And that's something Mark Pope made an emphasis about. He said, we're looking for the right type of player that's going to fit what we do here, not necessarily the highest ranked player. He said, we know what Kentucky is. We know what we have. And we know what we're looking to build. And that, to me, was really interesting because we will see. We'll see this year. You know, it's way too early to count your chickens before they hatch. We don't know how this team's going to react to losing. And you look at this schedule, they're going to lose some games. That's just a fact. This team could win the national title, but they're going to lose some games to get there. This is a daunting schedule. I mean, you look at the non-con, you got Indiana, who knows what they're going to look like with their new coach. You got St. John's with Rick Pitino. You got Michigan State, I believe. You got North Carolina. You got Gonzaga. You got a lot of really, really big teams on this schedule. And you get to the SEC, and that's a whole other animal. They're going to lose games, and we'll see how this team reacts to that adversity. We'll see how they react to losing. We'll see how they react to close games. We'll see how they react if they lose one or two in a row. You know, how's that going to go? But so far, all we've heard is that these guys are team-oriented. They want to win basketball games. They want to win games. And we heard that last year too, you know, this ragtag group of transfers from anywhere from, you know, one of the higher rated players in the portal to Kobe Brea to a guy like Ansley Almanor, who might not have been really recruited that heavily by people coming out of Fairleigh Dickinson. They got this team back to the Sweet 16 for the first time since 2019. It is just a fact to say, listen, you can love last year's team. Some of Calipari's last teams were way more talented than last year's team was. They just were, right? That's just a fact. They were more talented than last year's Kentucky team. But last year's Kentucky team got to the Sweet 16. Some of that's obviously draw. Some of that's obviously, you know, situation going to the tournament. But part of that is that Mark Pope is recruiting a certain type of player with a certain type of mentality to be here at Kentucky, to build what they're trying to build. And if they can keep that up, I think the sky's really the limit, and it's going to be really interesting to see.
Yeah, for sure. So just that just meticulous, the detail, the the fact that Almanor, just the little bitty facets of the game, not overall athleticism. He's not going to be what you want, but the way they look at it, he's a perfect fit. The dude comes in, he's knocked down corner three, and then he even changed it up and put the ball on the floor and got that and one against Tennessee. But just the little like micro facets is what they look for. They go over everything with a fine tooth comb. Between him and Figure and Fox and Brooks, all those guys, the whole staff, it's just their approach is really unique and interesting the way they look at putting the team together. And like you said, this guy might be, hey, everybody wants a 5-star total package. Nope, we'll walk away. It's not what we're looking for. So just really unique approach to the way they look at things.
Absolutely. And it's an important approach, I think. In the modern era, not that it wasn't this way before in some, but in the modern era, you still got NIL, you've got revenue sharing, you've got so much, there are recruits out there who are very good basketball players. And I think of a quote from Ted Lasso a little bit. They asked about this superstar player in season 1. They said, so what's he like? They said, oh, he's great at football. There are guys like that. And just because someone is extremely talented does not mean they're going to be the best player in your team. And we've seen situations where teams are talented and they just don't succeed because they don't have the identity that other teams that do succeed do. And it seems like Mark Pope's being very deliberate about focusing on preserving Kentucky's culture, Kentucky's identity. And he is looking at getting these big players. I mean, Jasper Johnson's a highly ranked player. Malachi Marino is a McDonald's All-American. If they do end up landing Stokes, that's the number 1 player in the class. There are still good players coming in. You look at the transfer portal. I mean, Aberdeen won a national title. Mohamed Diabate was a highly ranked player who came to Kentucky after Alabama landed Taylor Bowen, who's one that Kentucky was going after at the time anyway, but unfortunate there. They've got some big players in the portal, and these are also guys who are highly ranked portal transfers. So Kentucky is still getting very good players. They're still getting these big names. They're just not going for them because they're those big names. They're not going for them because of the number next to their name. They're going for them because they like what they bring to the table. They like the way they think. They like the way they fit in this team style. And I think that that's going to be really, really important for this team going forward.
Absolutely.
On the same vein, Jalen Lowe talked to me about how it was a big part of the reason he came to Kentucky. The way, it's easy to forget when we look at him now. Otega Owe was not Otega Owe before he came to Kentucky. A lot of people weren't thinking that much about Otega Owe when he entered the portal from Oklahoma. He comes to Kentucky. Now he's got a chance to be SEC Player of the Year after having to choose to come out of the NBA draft. Lamont Butler was a defensive guy who was most famous for making a shot for San Diego State in the tournament, and he became a star point guard. He dealt with his shoulder injury all season, really, but he was a great player for Kentucky. There are guys who transformed their careers by playing just even 1 year under Mark Pope and the way and that was something Jalen Lowe said to me. He said, I saw what happened to those guys. I saw the way their offensive numbers improved, the way they went up. That was a big selling point for me in coming to Kentucky.
Mm-hmm.
He also said, I asked him, I was like, I'm not going to ask you to slander Pitt. I'm not going to do that to you. I know what kind of player you are. It's like, but there were times at Pittsburgh where it felt like if you didn't try to make a play wasn't getting made, right? And, now you're on a team that's super, super deep. It's super, super talented. You're able to kind of facilitate more. You're able to, focus on getting better shots for yourselves. What is that like? He's like, this is exactly what you want as a point guard. He's like, this is what you dream of as a point guard. And he said, and Pope and his staff have been very deliberate with me about focusing on getting good shots, not taking bad shots, not taking some of those bad looks that he was kind of forced to take at Pittsburgh, but focusing on getting good shots. And if there isn't a good shot there, pass the ball, facilitate, curate the offense. He said, this is exactly what, this is all, the offensive numbers going up, the focusing on getting good shots, the having more weapons to dish out to. He said, this is why I came to Kentucky. This is what I'm here to do. I want to win basketball games, and I think that this team can do it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So that's why the excitement is continuing to build. And fortunately, BBN doesn't have to wait as long because the season starts earlier than it ever has. So we'll be diving right on in here the next couple of weeks. Off we'll go. Are you gonna, if Kentucky hopefully makes a deep run in the spring, you'll have a deep March April run. Hopefully, UK baseball will be in full swing. Are you still gonna find time to watch the UFL Kings, the Louisville Kings UFL squad? You gonna work that into your rotation as well? Because Kentucky's gonna have a pro football team this spring, Cole.
I don't know that it was going to be in my rotation regardless. Respectfully, I hope they succeed, but how are you going to move to Louisville, Kentucky, and in your introductory video call yourself Louisville? What are we doing
Yeah.
here?
Hey,
What are we doing here?
egregious. That's egregious.
I also used to work for Lexington Sporting Club, pro soccer team here in Lexington, so I'm a little bit offended seeing another pro team come to the state in Louisville wearing green with a horse as their logo. I'm like, what are we doing here?
It's,
But
so they're gonna be in the Lynn Family Stadium, gonna be in the soccer stadium, and
yeah.
I know we're in Kentucky and the horse capital of the world, but when you're the king, you look like the knight logo on the chessboard. It just throws me off. It looks like the knights instead of the kings. But anyway,
I don't know. I'm hoping they succeed. I'm interested. I've kind
yeah,
of to get into the UFL as much as I really got into. I was in high school. I really got into the AAF. Shout out Trent Richardson and my Birmingham Iron that I believed in. I was like 1 week away from buying a pennant when the whole league just collapses, and I'm like, well, good thing I didn't, right? And then the XFL comes back, and I tried to get into it. I respect the Battlehawks and what they do, and then the USFL I didn't really get into, and now that those two merge make the UFL, I like sports. I do. I like sports. I can get into any kind of sports league. I don't like American football enough to watch a second tier league.
Yeah, that's
I cover college football as part of my job. I follow the NFL. I play fantasy football. I watch my teams. I watch big college games that are on outside of Kentucky, but I don't like American football enough to watch a second tier pro sports league. I just don't. I don't watch minor league baseball either. It's just a fact. I don't. So, hope they succeed. If it gets big, maybe I'll tune in. Maybe I'll even go to a game or two. Maybe they got a good atmosphere. But oof. Will I be repping the merch? Probably not.
Hope it does well. Glad they, something else in Louisville, something to do in the spring. Maybe the atmosphere will be good and it'll be a good draw. But after the Super Bowl, I flipped to. I mean, I like all sports too. Once the Super Bowl's over, I move on to it's the NBA playoffs, and then opening day of baseball is coming seasonally. And look, there's guys that your Cole Kubelik and Greg McElroy, they are breaking down film. They go right from the college football playoff right into UFL, and they're talking about football all on their. They're built for it, and I move on to the other stuff once spring does hit. And
listen, this might be a hot take for me. I think people might dislike this about me. In terms of the big four American sports of baseball, hockey, football, and basketball, I probably rank football fourth out of those four.
Wow.
In terms of my favorite. I know a lot of people would say either baseball or hockey. I'd rather sit down and watch a Red Sox game than an American football game most times.
Wow. Yeah.
I played American football. It's not that I just don't get it. I'm from right here in Kentucky. I played American football. I've watched plenty of it. And I don't dislike it. That doesn't mean it's bad. It's just out of the four, it's the one that I want to watch the least.
Wow. Yeah, you might be. Now, in this day and age, you've been the minority of that count, but that's all right. I get it. So, new team coming to Kentucky, and like you said, hope they succeed and do well, and we'll see how many people are out there watching the Kings this spring. So, throwing that in on the last little news and notes of Believe in Kentucky. Basketball season's on the way, everybody. The women's team is loaded as well. Just got a new commit today. Emily McDonald, top 25 player. Kenny Brooks is already, amassing talent. So they're going to be good. Kentucky volleyball is on right now against Texas A&M. So,
Yeah, I mean, I'm honestly amazed we got to this whole show without saying that in a really unprecedented move, the MLB just canceled the playoffs after the wild card round. There's no more games going on, guys. Don't fact check that. They just ended after the wild card round. Nothing more, nothing to watch.
yeah, that's it. Till how many days till spring training starts?
Too many. Need my Red Sox to come back stronger.
That's it. Haven't heard from your Yankees guys at all. I'm sure they didn't say anything to you at all.
No, they got their own bird issues to deal with right now. So
that's it. So good stuff, man. Yeah. Red Sox and Braves come back strong next year, and you'll have two happy co-hosts on this podcast. So.
Hopefully.
Appreciate you, man. Looking forward to the basketball yearbook coming out. Everybody check Cole out on the Cat's Paws radio as well with Big Blue Insider and however many other shows you're on a weekly basis. Check Cole out, follow him, read all the content. Do the same thing with us here on Believe in Kentucky, and we'll be back next week with another episode. So until then, go Cats, stay safe, everybody, and we'll be back again on Believe in Kentucky on the Believe Podcast Network.